Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekacek.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 7th episode of By-The-Bywater. Great to talk to you all again. We are just coming off of all sorts of getting everything set up and ready to go, and we're on a time schedule on the other end, but we think we can do this episode. It's all through, but tea is ready, water is ready, we're all here. How is everyone doing?
Amazing.
Good.
Amazing. That's good. Amazing is good. So, as mentioned, on just enough of a time crunch on this episode, so much as I would like to do my usual tell you about things randomly for 10 minutes, let's just go right into it a bit. But before the news, one further thing to note as a follow-on from last episode. So we got a great response to the last episode from Luke Shelton on Twitter. Thank you very much. To read his 2 tweets in response. Had time to listen to the latest By-The-Bywater. I like the discussion of male friendships in Lord of the Rings. All right. The one area I thought could have used a little polish was the discussion of Tolkien's personal relationships. Could I recommend a source? And he did. This was John D. Rateliff's chapter, The Missing Women, J.R.R. Tolkien's lifelong support of women's higher education, from the book Perilous and Fair, Women in the Works and Life of J.R.R. Tolkien. And I thought, okay, so I picked that up yesterday and gave it a read. And Rateliff, which should be noted, is very much a well-known and well-respected Tolkien scholar. He is the guy who finally put together the edition, The History of the Hobbit book that came out some years ago. And so he knows the subject. Would take a long while to unpack the whole essay, but I thought it was a good read on both agreed against Humphrey Carpenter's biography to a degree, as well as putting in more information that Carpenter might not have necessarily had at the time in terms of remembrances from other people. And it's a bit broad in terms of its in scope, which is good in terms of what he's touching on. But he makes a pretty solid case, I think, that in fact Tolkien really was very much supportive of women in academia, and that in doing so really brought a broader range than necessarily was there. He also, and I would just throw this out there again, I might send you guys this essay to have a chance to review it. He makes the case that Tolkien had a blind spot in that he fully appreciated and supported women in academia, but his blind spot was he didn't see the glass ceiling. He, quite literally, he could not see the glass ceiling. In other words, his attitude was, this is kind of weird. Why are so many smart, intelligent students who happen to be women not pursuing further with their degree and rising up in academia? And again, it seems like he didn't quite get that. That's Rateliff's argument, essentially, is that who he was in his position in time didn't quite sense the larger institutional biases at play, which I think is a fair argument. So,
I would have been surprised if he had.
Yeah, agreed. But yeah, no, I do recommend it. The whole book looks very interesting too. It's a whole range of essays. I'm very glad for the recommendation. So thank you, Luke, for that. We appreciate that feedback, and we always appreciate feedback of any sort. It really helps us learn a bit more about the subject we're all here for, and that I think is really great. We could say more, but we need to move on. We've got things to talk about, and that means moving on to the news. So, Jared, please take it away.
So it didn't seem like there would be much news to talk about this time around because not much has been happening until yesterday. There was a formal confirmation that the Amazon series would be filming in New Zealand, but that was about it. But then, a couple days ago, a wider casting call has gone out from various agencies for, presumably, a variety of background actors. They specifically indicated a mix of people of all ages and genders, and a mention of multiracial backgrounds. All of that sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Everything from people who are quote, bearded, hairy biker types, or who have missing teeth, or, again, quote, wonderful noses.
Which is a weird euphemism.
That sounds so loaded, and I don't know if it really is or not. Wonderful noses, musicians, circus performers who can apparently juggle or walk on stilts are also being considered. They're almost certainly casting elves because they want people with beautiful, fair, fine-boned faces who are willing to wear sheer clothing.
Sexy elves.
Yeah. And they also want both shorter and taller people as well. Interestingly, they also specifically mention wanting redheads of all ages, shapes, and sizes, as well as people with a lot of freckles.
Yeah, that's the one that stood out to me. I'm like, what are they? Are they casting Ireland in Middle? What's going on?
Yeah,
I mean, any
right?
guesses there? I mean,
Who's redheaded in Middle Earth?
I don't know. So it's very specific. That's the thing that grabs me. It's like, okay, they really want redheads. Why?
Right.
So, but having said that, I mean, yeah, this is kind of promising because it seems like the scope is very wide. If they were looking for a lot of different people with a lot of different things, I mean, it sounds like they're sort of continuing what is, it's admittedly established with the films, even more so that, dwarves look like this, elves look like this, etc. It sounds like we're getting some of that, which, okay, I understand. But if they're going for this range, it's incredibly suggestive. I mean, given we still don't really know what the framing of the story is going to be. Do you have any guesses? I mean, I'm still trying to sort of puzzle this one all out.
I can't figure it out. And I kind of don't want to in a way, just because I kind of want to be surprised by this in a good way. Like, I want to be delighted by what I see on the screen. And this seems somewhat promising, I guess. I don't know. Is the red-haired thing, like, because Will Poulter is, like, redheaded and freckly, right?
I thought he was blonde.
I might be thinking of someone else. Never mind.
I'm trying to think of who's described as redheaded in the books, and I don't think anybody is. The only thing I could think is, like, the fairer kinds of hobbits. With
Right.
Huge air quotes around fair,
Right.
because that...
Well,
anyway.
I mean, literally, the just redhead, like, lighter hair color, like, not fair as in, like, a judgment of aesthetic pleasingness, but
Right.
as in just actually denoting what color hair.
And wonderful noses. Let's not
And
forget the
what
wonderful
is
noses.
the wonder?
Yeah.
Like, are they talking about, like, bulbousy potato type noses and like?
I don't know. That sounds like dwarf casting to me.
Yeah.
Could be.
Yeah.
And the circus performer thing, we were talking briefly on Twitter DM about this, and Jared, you brought up that at least in Bree, they did the stilt casting thing where they had people to do perspective shots there. They only did it for that, though. I think it was one of those things they thought it was an experiment that didn't quite work out. So. Yeah, I
thought
know.
it looked amazing, but
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I thought I would agree. I thought there were some of the more effective shots in the film, but maybe they're just trying it again. Yeah. So yeah, we still don't know any more than that. There's still been no other formal casting or news, but sounds like things are grinding forward. So it may be a steady drip from here on in. And
I do like the. Sorry to interrupt.
No.
I do like the extremely inclusive language that they appear to be using.
Yes.
Because the movies are really, really white. And
Yes.
it's nice.
No, fully agreed. I mean, that stood out for me as well. Oriana, I'm guessing you would have some thoughts too on that.
Yeah, cast Taika Waititi for the love of,
Yeah.
or like anyone who looks like right. Oh my God, yes, Taika as Elrond. Can we start that? Like, is there a hashtag that we can start? I feel like he would be game, right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
He would bring this
yeah.
wonderful energy to Elrond that I think would be really cool.
And I think it would also be good, too, because, I mean, this was implied. It was never really spelled out, but it was certainly noticeable in both Lord of the Rings films and the Hobbit trilogy that all the Maori actors who got roles pretty much were under masks.
Yeah.
Or just, or playing orcs. It's like,
Why would you hide those faces? Don't hide those faces.
exactly. So in some ways, this could be a new promising variation on it. I mean, the location in New Zealand was chosen for the reasons it was, and for things besides. But yeah, let's see what this alternate approach gives us. But I guess we'll find out more at some point. No other real news, so let's just plunge right in. So, Ghân-buri-Ghân, a wonderful name. Let's make it clear. Tolkien's hit-miss ratio on names was pretty positive, and this is another positive example. Something that suggests everything from lineage to a possible honorific to much more besides. It is, of course, very self-consciously other. The use of the circumflex above the A sounds in the name is not something found in the English alphabet. So its very use, like the occasional accent mark or other circumflex choices, is meant to suggest to the expected reader in English something that's not what one normally finds. But what is normal? That leads into the larger issue of this character, one of Tolkien's most unusual, most problematic, to use a sometimes generic choice of word these days, but also one of his most essential, even though his role is so brief. If you're familiar with The Lord of the Rings predominantly through the adaptations, you won't have encountered him. Neither Bakshi, nor Rankin Bass, or Jackson included him in their film and TV versions, nor did Brian Sibley in his BBC radio adaptations, though intriguingly Bernard Mays did do so for his NPR version. In the story, the Rohirrim, led by King Theoden, encounter him in a forest, specifically the Drúedain forest, during the epic ride to Minas Tirith, having had to withdraw into the trees due to the road to the city being held by an orc army. But we see the encounter through the eyes of Merry, secreted away with the help of Éowyn and others from the king's knowledge. Merry himself first wonders what the strange drums he's been hearing for some time could signify. Then hears word of a meeting between Theoden and the chief of the Drúedain, or the Wild Men of the Woods, that's happening. To quote the book, with Merry at one point thinking of a series of ancient statues that he had noted at the Rohirrim's military hold at Dunharrow, quote, "There sat Theoden and Éomer, and before them on the ground sat a strange squat of a man, gnarled as an old stone, and the hairs of his scanty beard straggled on his lumpy chin like dry moss. He was short-legged and fat-armed, thick and stumpy, and clad only with grass about his waist. Merry felt that he had seen him somewhere before, and suddenly he remembered the Púcal men of Dunharrow. Here was one of those old images brought to life, or maybe a creature descended in true line through endless years from the models used by the forgotten craftsmen long ago. His voice was deep and guttural, yet to Merry's surprise he spoke the common speech, though in a halting fashion, and uncouth words were mingled with it." End quote. Now, there's an obvious and rampant othering in all this descriptive talk, ranging from appearance to language to direct comparisons to stone to even the clothes or the lack thereof. Yet Ghân-buri-Ghân demonstrates almost from the start that he's also exactly on the level of Theoden and Éomer, a proud man, a chieftain, who quickly shows he knows their predicament, bats down a presumption about his exact knowledge of the siege of Minas Tirith, responds to an interruption with a command, not a request, that he be allowed to finish his report, and then extend his offer of help from his people as guides from the Rohirrim. When Theoden accepts and offers rewards and gifts, Ghân-buri-Ghân's response is a mix of the honorable and horrifyingly grim, end quote. "Dead men are not friends to living men, and give them no gifts. But if you live after the darkness, then leave wild men alone in the woods, and do not hunt them like beasts any more. Ghân-buri-Ghân will not lead you into trap. He will go himself with Father of Horsemen, and if he leads you wrong, you will kill him." End quote. The suggestions of history here are deeper than the narrative immediately indicates. The Rohirrim have lived in Rohan for centuries at this point, and Gondor had further ruled over the area for millennia prior to that. Ghân-buri-Ghân's own use of an othering term, comparing his people to beasts, but doing so in a way that he well knows that's how the Rohirrim think about him and his people, rather than how they think about themselves as fellow men. This shows both hard-earned knowledge on Ghân-buri-Ghân's part and immediate cleverness in turn. Ghân-buri-Ghân's people succeed as guides, and after departing to let the Rohirrim prepare for their epic charge, with Ghân-buri-Ghân himself remarking with, quote, "a light in his eyes, wind is changing," end quote, an early signal of the shift in the wider weather that heralds the dissipation of Mordor's murk, Ghân-buri-Ghân's people don't appear in the narrative again, except towards the end, when the now King Aragorn approaches, but does not directly encounter them, in their forest home, and heralds announce that, in the same way that the hobbits eventually gain the land of the Shire as their own to solely live and rule in, the Drúedain are specifically granted their lands as theirs, and theirs alone. A distant roll of drums signals acceptance, and thus their story is concluded. But as with so much in Tolkien, it really wasn't, and our discussion needs to touch on such things as the Drúedain, the chapter in Unfinished Tales where he spoke in much greater detail about these people and their intertwined history with the Edain, and eventually the Dunedain, as the First and Second Age progressed. But Ghân-buri-Ghân's people are related yet separate from them in turn, one of the many civilizations of men in Middle-earth who were, quote, there first, end quote, even if, of course, the elves were first in the timeline. This and other backgrounds were ultimately never fully developed entirely, outside of the very late essay of Dwarves and Men, featured in the final Middle-earth volume, The Peoples of Middle-earth, from which the Drúedain in Unfinished Tales was excerpted. This sense of the various native peoples of Middle-earth, who lived well away from Beleriand and the events of the First Age, were daunted by both the Númenóreans and by Sauron, and who, in the case of Ghân-buri-Ghân specific people, were once hemmed in, ignored, and in at least some cases hunted by larger colonial powers. These are incredibly deep waters. And Ghân-buri-Ghân's portrayal here is more than slightly influenced by the specifically Eurocentric ideal of the, quote, noble savage, unquote, which has come down in American history as much as it has European, with all the further colonial implications therein. Yet I'll end my introduction to our discussion by noting that Tolkien's own sense of the context he grew up in, the British Empire, the largest socio-political state the world had ever seen, was clearly not simply celebratory or even accepting. While Ghân-buri-Ghân is a stock character in many ways, and while there's much to look at with open and very careful eyes when it comes to rule, not to mention race, in Middle-earth, whether it was Tolkien's youthful argument for Irish home rule before World War I, or his anger at the growth of apartheid in the land of his birth, South Africa, in comments ranging from a letter to his son Christopher to a speech he gave at Oxford, there's a lot of careful nuance that needs considering. But it's time to open up the floor, so turning it over to you guys.
Okay, Jared is still drawing, which is great. I can't wait to see what Ghân-buri-Ghân looks like.
Fully agreed.
Me too.
Yeah, this is a very interesting thing because I read, I actually just started this by Googling Tolkien and colonialism just to see what would pop up, and one of them was a Reddit thread on like the socialist subreddit, and that was a disaster on so many levels. But I came across this dissertation that I'm so sorry, Louise Lieber, I didn't read all 317 pages of it, but I started. It was a dissertation for her PhD at the University of Limerick. It's called Reimagining Tolkien, a Post-Colonial Perspective on the Lord of the Rings, and there's lots of really good and interesting stuff in there. But one of the things that interests me, as like I've never been into literary theory, film theory, critical theory, but I feel like it sometimes ignores the obvious. Like to me, Ghân-buri-Ghân feels like a very obvious, almost imagining of what would have happened if the Neanderthals had continued to exist in the world. Am I crazy for thinking that? Like that, it feels very Occam's razor to me that, it's not necessary. Like there's elements of the noble savage stereotype there for sure. Mm-hmm. But it's like appearance-wise in particular, it feels very like Ghân-buri-Ghân just looks like a Neanderthal. Like that's just, and Ghân-buri-Ghân rules. He's like, I know how to count pretty high. I can, we can do all this stuff. And it does cast a really interesting light on the Rohirrim, who we have, been introduced to as these heroes, these great guys, but they're also colonizers in a way because they were given that land by Gondor and have been terrorizing the native population since. And that's...
Yeah, they've been hunting them for sport.
Yeah, and it is. It's a very small moment, and it doesn't really, come up again, but it's you're like, oh, there's some... Because Tolkien himself is very, all of the rest of the work is extremely anti-imperialist and anti-colonialism. The Númenóreans, they lost their home because they were imperialist pieces of garbage. That's, that's what happened. It's a pretty clear-cut warning against doing that. So it's always interesting to see other people who try to read, any kind of support for colonialism in these works.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I wish it was more in the popular ones, the Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, rather than just left to the background material.
Right.
Because, honestly, until researching for this topic, I didn't know there were Drúedain on Númenor. Which is really interesting because that is that's a lot of the racial issues and stuff that happen in Middle-earth. I mean, sort of looking from the outside in, are tied to Númenor being that's where the purest of men are from. That's the pure blood. And then these people are here too.
Yeah.
And I think they don't survive Númenor, but
they mostly left, was my understanding. Like they got out of there. They realized, it's not so good anymore.
Well, I think there's two different versions, right? There's one where they do leave because they're like, you guys suck now.
Yes.
And then there's a version where they just kind of die out slowly, and then the last few, I think, are taken in the downfall of Númenor. I just think that's really interesting because the one encounter in the book is kind of racist. In a benevolent way, which is still racism.
Sort of an unthinking way, almost.
Yeah, like he saw a Native American in a movie once and was like, well, okay. Yeah, it changed things for me, noting that he did put these people in this sort of terrestrial paradise he set up for the best of mankind. So it's way more complicated than just like, well, here's this guy who's a caricature of any number of things.
It's interesting how I was, doing some double checking on this, how I basically wanted to see how exactly Ghân-buri-Ghân entered the story as Tolkien wrote it. And in reviewing War of the Ring, I think is the History of Middle-earth book that Christopher Tolkien put together that covers that particular subject. So in rereading the chapter there, Tolkien initially had it that there were no people, that the Rohirrim just sort of went through or found their way through. Then his next step was to create, saying that Merry's hearing, well, there are these guides who are going to help us, and he sees these mysterious figures sort of in the mist that sort of help them, but there's no more interaction than that, or any interaction was strictly, off camera, as it were. And then when Tolkien introduces Ghân-buri-Ghân, he does so kind of in a flash, like there's no puzzling out the name, nothing like that. Per Christopher Tolkien, that whole section sort of comes as is. It's like, wait, I've got it. He thought it over, wrote it out, and it was almost essentially unchanged from that point forward. So there's no sense that the character had been like kicking around or anything like that. He sort of came in the moment, and that would have been back in the 40s. And so everything that you referred to there, Jared, and which is good to note, it's sort of like, as you say, the supplemental materials is sort of like, it's a bit like we've raised before, I think, with Galadriel too. It's sort of like, I've got this character here, what's the deal? How do I explain it? And you mentioned the connection to Númenor. We should give a little bit of the important backstory. Now, this is not Ghân-buri-Ghân's people as such, but in the essay that I mentioned, the Drúedain, which is part again of this larger essay towards the end of Tolkien's life, it was like 68, 70 or something like that, called Of Dwarves and Men. He went into who the Drúedain exactly were, who the wild men, etc., quote unquote, were. The idea is that in the Silmarillion, there are the three houses of men, and the one that is the smallest house, the House of Haleth, who mostly keep themselves to begin with, they have a further subset of people with them who keep themselves even more, and that happens to be the Drúedain. And they are the people explicitly described as people connected to Ghân-buri-Ghân's people. And what Oriana was saying, which I hadn't thought about at all, which you're absolutely right, the idea of what if Neanderthals, it's like, you're onto something, because the idea is shorter, the heavy brow, the idea, something like that. There is almost sort of like, not quite a stereotype of this image of that. And the idea is that they were always very friendly and but still a people apart from the House of Haleth. They hated the orcs just as much. They're sort of crypto-magical in their own way. There's like folklore. It's interesting levels of, in a story that's Tolkien's own folklore, there are these people, the House of Haleth, who have folklore about the Drúedain. It's like, Inception, where are the layers? And they go on forever. But I think it's really striking just to see how that plays out. And more I can go with that, but I want to stop here if people want to throw in and sort of take things from there.
No, the magical powers that they have, it's a connection to nature, and it makes sense. Tolkien and his, magical connections to nature is that's kind of classic him. But it is
that's our John.
that's our JRR. It is one of those, it is kind of an unavoidable, I don't know, there's several ways that you can look at it. One is like still kind of racist, like, sort of Native American, like, oh, they're, more, they have a magical connection to the land, which again, like, I don't know, it feels racist, is it? I don't know.
It's definitely a racist trope of like the less advanced civilizations are like purer and closer to nature and all that. And I'm sorry for everybody who just had to hear me say that.
Right. We don't believe this ourselves.
No, we don't.
No.
By-The-Bywater does not endorse that viewpoint. at all. But if you do feel more, I don't know, whatever. Anyway, or if it really is this idea of these people who like genuinely just come from a slightly different evolutionary branch, who are maybe because they. I actually should have thought about this more before opening my mouth. Because the elves have this connection to Arda and to nature and to earth, so they're almost like stunted elves in a weird way, like funhouse mirror elves, like they're squat and short. And there's a story about one of them with the people of Haleth, who a chieftain who like sets a watch on his the Edain's house with stones. He's like, these stones will watch you while I'm away tending to my brother or whatever who's grievously ill, and only he could, only this Drúedain could fix it. So it's weird. It's a weird mishmash of some kind of race-ish, like other. Some people, I was looking, and some people were calling it Orientalism, and I was like, I feel like this is also kind of a fun, because they're like, well, the Southerlings and the Easterlings, it's very like all of the bad stuff comes from the East and blah, blah, blah. I was like, it only comes from the East. Like the bad stuff comes from the East only because Tolkien was taking his idea of the West as paradise, not from some modern conception of the West, which is garbage. But it's genuinely from ancient Irish and Welsh, Gaelic, Celtic folklore, where the West is the unknown and it is it's fairyland.
It's the land of the
yeah,
dead.
like it's that's and because that is the West, then kind of by default, the opposing cardinal direction, that's where the bad stuff comes from. I don't think it's certainly not a conscious effort to say East bad or whatever.
Yeah, there's a lot kicking around with that, and I might come back to that. But actually, Jared, did you have another point you want to bring up along those lines before I go forward? Or
I don't know. I mean, I disagree specifically with the choice of the term Orientalist, just because they are.
I don't
the
even know.
Drúedain are in the West.
I also keep.
But that's just nitpicking. That's just pedantry. Don't listen to me. Related to things coming from the East, I think that is what am I trying to say? He is locating the source of evil in the East for a lot of reasons, all of which make sense in story, but I don't know if you can really let him off that easy, just because the East throughout European literature is still like the source of danger and mystery and sin and all. Like, it is kind of Orientalist to have things in the East, and that separate from talking about Ghân-buri-Ghân, I would say that he was probably a little Orientalist himself just anyway, just on his own. Yeah. I don't think this character is Orientalist. I think there's a separate set of issues here. Right.
And that is worth talking about. Yeah, as I've said before, just because we talk about certain subjects once in an episode doesn't mean we won't talk about them again. Yeah. So you'll bring that up. But let me take the focus. I was sort of hinting at this a bit more with the conclusion here. Let me sort of aim it in a slightly different direction, back to questions of colonial practice, for better or worse, as a term, and that is Tolkien's own viewpoint on that in his life, as much as we know it. And again, I wanted to emphasize that he had a interesting skepticism of empire to a degree that still has troubling aspects to it. Maybe that's the best way to describe it, or at least has the potential for that. And let me sort of elaborate on this. I mentioned the Irish Home Rule thing. Now, quite literally, we're still seeing the effects of English colonialism in Ireland to this day. Brexit is currently held up on this very specific point because of decisions that were made hundreds of years ago. This is not ancient history. It continues echoing down. But for the benefit of those who may not be as familiar with this particular particular issue I was referring to in terms of the time period, when Tolkien was a young man before World War I, when he was still essentially a schoolboy and then going to Oxford. This is mentioned in Humphrey Carter's biography, that when it came to he and his good friend, one of the TCBS, Wiseman, that Wiseman was very much for, the Ireland staying, just as part of the United Kingdom, whereas Tolkien apparently was arguing for home rule. And this is a very important subject, a deeply important subject in Victorian and Edwardian, in the United Kingdom in Victorian and Edwardian times. Absolutely. And essentially it was resolved post-World War I because after the Easter Rebellion and then the further Irish Rebellion, history took its course. So we see where it went from there. But again, the idea of home rule is, to a degree, and I'm not trying to draw any exact equivalence here, please nobody shout at me, but to a degree, what we're seeing, what happened in the past 20 years with a certain devolution of control in Scotland, for instance, where we now have the Scottish Parliament, etc. I'm not trying to draw one-to-one, don't quote me on this. I'm merely saying that the idea of home rule was pretty much saying, hey, the Irish Parliament, which was here at one point, if I remember correctly, we'd like to have it back here. We'd like to have members of parliament here in Dublin, colonial affairs, foreign affairs, fine, that's you guys. Again, I'm heavily oversimplifying. But the point is, this was a major, major political issue, and arguably it is a reaction to empire writ large from the first, from one point of view, from the very first colonial land conquered by England outside of the larger island it's on. Again, I'm heavily oversimplifying. Do not quote me. I'm just trying to point out that this was Tolkien's reaction. He was not going for yes, the empire is good. He's like, no, the empire is not the uniform solution, is what he's arguing, at least in this specific case. And this, and the other thing I'd like to bring up is looking ahead. And I mentioned this. This was from the letter to Christopher Tolkien that he wrote during World War II, when Christopher Tolkien was stationed there and working in the Air Force. And this is the quote from letter 61 in the letters, is where to look it up. And this is, again, Tolkien to Christopher, in response to a comment that Christopher Tolkien made about what he saw in terms of local conditions, i.e., clearly a fact that it was white supremacy at work. As for what you say or hint of local conditions, I knew of them. I don't think they have very much changed, even for the worse. I used to hear them discussed by my mother, and have ever since taken a special interest in that part of the world. The treatment of color nearly always horrifies anyone going out from Britain, and not only in South Africa. Unfortunately, not many retain that generous sentiment for long. End quote. Now, obviously, this is, even more explicitly tied into questions of race, but tie it into his earlier sentiment about what we have with Ireland. And now let's take it back to Ghân-buri-Ghân and his people and the imaginative landscape of Middle-earth and where we are. We're talking about a civilization that, per their own history, per Ghân-buri-Ghân's own history, mentioning about how his people have the memory of Minas Tirith being constructed. Mm-hmm. That was 3,000 years ago. And Gondor is 3,000 years old plus. And Rohan, of course, has been more recent in terms of the land. But the point is, they've been there. And this is a small little enclave of forest that is a couple of days' ride from Minas Tirith. In other words, it's been a small little thing that's literally been ignored, seemingly, by the wider powers beyond it. And even though, as of course, they're hunted, hemmed in, there's a sense of watchful reaction. It's just sort of like, okay, it's this interesting sense of resistance to empire, resistance to even assimilation. Lots of interesting questions are raised by the existence of something there. And I think Tolkien sometimes is a bit, I don't want to say loose with history, but sometimes seems to treat history as something that things don't change for very, very long times. We can see that as a flaw, but I think in this case, he's making an argument that a people can have a certain sense of, here's who we are, and we're still here after all this time. And I think that really, there's a lot to unpack there. And I think tied in with this idea of, again, Irish home rule, referring back to that again, but this wider sentiment, this sense, and I think you see it throughout the imaginative landscape of Middle-earth, that he's not arguing for an assimilated empire, which arguably would be Sauron's, where it's sort of like, y'all are to me. It's more like, here are a bunch of peoples.
Right.
And we all are in our place, and we are who we are.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a very interesting distinction to raise. And I'll stop there for now.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the fact, he did not have to put the Drúedain or Ghân-buri-Ghân in there at all. Like, he just didn't have to. Like, and he did. And I think it's interesting. There's some problems with even the idea of like peoples unto themselves forever and always, and you know, I think that, like, again, I keep going back to that almost throwaway line of just don't hunt us down anymore like wild beasts. He didn't have to put that in there. There was no real, but like it totally, it makes you rethink everything you've heard about Rohan and its people. He didn't have to. And I think that's nice.
There's an interesting sort of, I think Ned briefly talked about this, sort of parallel between the Drúedain and the hobbits.
Yeah.
Where, you know, they're given their own land where they've kind of been living all along, so it's just like a formality.
Right.
But there's something interesting about hobbits who really don't look that much like people, like humans.
Speak for yourself.
Unintentionally speciesist.
Speak for yourself.
They're really tiny. They've got hairy feet. They're kind of weird looking. But people don't hunt them for sport.
Right.
But they're hunting the Drúedain for sport. And Drúedain look a little more human than hobbits. And it's interesting to me that Merry is the point of view character for this scene. He's one kind of other seeing another other. There's no good way to phrase that. Seeing this other person who has been otherized by this dominant power and sees him kind of sympathetically, I think.
Yeah.
Certainly more than Éomer in that moment.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. Merry doesn't seem to, he doesn't, you know, there's no language about like, oh, I suddenly feel an affinity towards, you know, things like, there's none of that. It's more reactive in the moment, but he's like, oh, well, great, you know, is kind of what it is. It's sort of like, I will simply accept this for what it is, and he doesn't dwell on what it might mean or what those very lines might mean, even though they're incredibly pointed. So, yeah. Yeah, no, as I was saying in my introduction, the sense of, you know, perceived equality, I guess, is the best way to do it. You know, in other words, it's sort of like, you know, perspective of the Rohirrim may be like, oh, who are you savages? And Ghân-buri-Ghân's like, I'm just as good as you. I really do think that's kind of the key to his character, as much as we see of him.
Yeah.
Is that, you know, he's sort of like, you know, look, you know, we're all in this together. And I think that's very, very important. And I also, you know, I didn't bring this up in the introduction, but I do like how, and this is talked about in Tolkien's later essay, how there has this very unusual laugh. You know, it's this sardonic sense of humor. You know, he's not simply stoic. You know, he does he does show anger. He does show amusement. He does show hope when we last see him. You know, wind is changing. You know, these are things that sort of like he's not a flat character. You know, there's nothing more to be deduced beyond that because we have nothing else. There's we literally have a very opaque picture of the entire society aside from him. You know, it's suggestive in that regard. I found something when I was looking around doing some research on this, sort of going back to maybe a larger point about these wider communities. And this is from, I'm going to look this up, this is from another thesis. This is from Christina Fawcett, who presented this in her degree, MA degree thing at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. The piece is called Play in Pacifist Space, Language in the Writing of J.R.R. Tolkien. And her observation was this. Tolkien's ideal state system, as manifest in his use of language as a mean of political exchange and of symbolic and effective power, involves the free interaction of ideas and cultures, without repressing or subsuming any people's nationality in a larger homogeneous state. Kind of what I was mentioning before. And then she goes on to say, the nations that exist prior to the War of the Ring remain as the threat to their space of difference has been quelled. Aragorn's establishment at the end of the War of the Ring is a rejection of the nationalist ideal of a stronger dominant state power, as Gondor's presence in other communities is guidance and protection rather than dominance or interference. Which is an interesting way to look at it because clearly it's still the dominant power,
right? Right.
You know, it's this, and that's why we have to now. You know, I've been talking about home rule. Home rule was not independence,
right? Right.
Tolkien was not necessarily arguing for Irish independence, and that's something that has to be underscored. And I maybe didn't do that earlier, so I do want to make sure that's sort of like spelled out there. His views re South Africa are not so far clear beyond that, at least not to my knowledge. But it's not that Tolkien wouldn't have maybe. Let me back that up. We don't have any immediate evidence that I know of. I could be wrong, that Tolkien was specifically arguing at some point for flat-out Irish independence. As far as I can tell, he was not. Whereas there were many people who very much were feeling that at the time. So, there was home rule was very much a push. That was the predominant push in the Irish political sphere for a lot of people, but there were people who were thinking beyond that.
Yeah.
So it's a conditional kind of thing.
Right.
It's a conditional sort of thing, and that's sort of... You add into the fact that, getting back to Ghân-buri-Ghân, they're a different people, but they are, how do you view difference? It's tangled. It's tangled. There's no easy way to look at this.
It is like, especially at the very end when Aragorn, rides through the forest and, graciously gives it to Ghân-buri-Ghân and his people and their descendants forever and ever. But that he still thinks that he is the one who gets to give it to them instead of just being like, yeah, we're not going to, no one will bother you. It was always your land. But no, it's this great, it's portrayed as this sort of gracious overlord, allowing this home rule of sorts,
Yeah.
Which, get better than a poke in the eye, but...
Yeah.
Baby steps, I guess, in the decolonization of Eriador, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I don't
No. I think there's something to that. I think that actually ties in kind of with what Tolkien was trying to do with the later writings, where he was sort of trying to introduce, if not a full self-interrogation, let's say, sort of more conditional ways of thinking about things. What's interesting in the essay of Dwarves and Men, and again, that's found in the Peoples of Middle-earth, is that he draws various distinctions and some further explanations, you might say. So he specifically talks about how the Drúedain are not hobbits. Mm-hmm. He is sort of his conception of okay, they are different peoples, and he was trying to explain that out, at least for his own satisfaction. He also specified how to speak of Rohan as its own miniature colonial power, he draws a distinction between them and the Dunlendings, who are, of course, are in the who are a part more explicitly in the book than they are in the movie. Although there's a brief scene in the movie about the wild men doing the raiding. The Dunlendings are very much part of the army of Saruman. There is a established in the appendices sense of how they were driven out when the Rohirrim came down and things like that. So, and he draws a distinction between that as well. It's almost sort of of the two people who were most immediately affected by the Rohirrim coming down, there was the good ones and the bad ones, writ large. And I'm but they're both human, aren't they?
Right.
So,
more or less.
Yeah. So, Deep Waters. I'm partial, that we're not done yet by any means, by no means.
I don't think we'll ever be done with this topic.
Oh no. There's much more to bring up and along the way, especially in terms of speaking of the East, the Easterlings and things like that. That could be a whole episode of its own.
Oh yeah.
But what I'd like to do is, since I've been mentioning the peoples of Middle Earth, I'd like to make reference to a very, very interesting story that is the very last story in that particular volume. It is not the last thing Tolkien ever wrote. It should be noted. It's just simply something that Christopher Tolkien discovered while working through the papers and included it. It was written in the mid-50s, around the time that Lord of the Rings was getting, I think, prepped for publication or about ready for publication. It was never finished. It ends literally in sort of scribbles and notes, as Christopher Tolkien describes it. And Tolkien himself, when he reviewed it some years later in the late 60s, did so going okay, I had an idea here, but I need to sort of square it away more properly with the how can I put this, with the geography of Middle-earth and the exact sort of history he'd come up with. It's not specifically about Ghân-buri-Ghân's people, it should be noted. If they're in here, they're only in here kind of more indirectly. But there is some interesting meditation on history and colonialism, one can say. And the story is called Tal-Elmar. very odd and interesting story. The best way to describe it is it's a story from the point of view of people who are living in what is now Gondor, more or less. Although, again, the geography and history doesn't exactly match. It's Middle-earthish, but not quite stable Middle-earth that we know. And it's basically the point of view of a member of these peoples basically seeing the Númenóreans arrive. And doing so with the knowledge that there have been earlier generations that have been affected by the Númenóreans, and at that point, the Númenóreans are already seen as a threat and bad, and a conquering colonial power who raid. And so that I think is just very fascinating in its own right. Now, it would take forever to unpack the story, and again, it's really worth reading because it's Middle Earth and it's Tolkien, but again, it's not quite the one we know.
Yeah.
It's this interesting variant. And one thing I would like to bring out from this story, though, is an exchange from the character's history, and this is the deal with that. So let me see if I can find it here. Here we are. So the idea is that Tal-Elmar, this lead character, is the grandchild of a union between one of these people who are kind of Ghân-buri-Ghân-ish like in terms of description, but it's not specifically said to be necessarily the Drúedain, although it's kind of like, you're like, oh, okay. And another group of people who we might say to be more like the Edain, like the House of Haleth or Hador or something like that. And this was done through violence. There was there was essentially, one group of people invading the other's lands. There was a reaction back to it, etc. So again, this is backstory. So what we have here is a case where the back history of this character, this is a description between this character's grandmother and grandfather some years before. The grandmother is, again, member of one of the House of Hador, etc., something like that. Yeah. And she has been captured by this more Ghân-buri-Ghân-like figure who has pretty much kept her enslaved and taken her to wife, if you will. And so at the point where it says that this wife has now learned enough of this guy's speech, and her name is Elmar, and different from Tal-Elmar, who was named after this character. So her name is Elmar, and his name is Boldar. So Elmar says to Boldar, I have much to thank thee for, Lord, but think not to ever get my love so. For thou hast torn me from my own people, and from him that I loved, and from the child that I bore him. For them ever shall I yearn and grieve, and give love to none else. Never again shall I be glad, while I am held captive among a strange folk that I deem base and unlovely. Ooh. So be it, said Boldar. But it is not to be thought that I should let thee go free, for thou art precious in my sight. And consider well, vain it is to seek escape from me. Long is the way to the remnant of thy folk, if any still live, and thou wouldst not go farther than the hills of Agar ere thou met death, or a life far worse than shall be thine in my house. Base and unlovely thou namest us. Truly, maybe. Yet true it is also that thy folk are cruel and lawless, and the friends of demons. Thieves are they. For our lands are ours from old, which they would wrest from us with their bitter blades. White skins and bright eyes are no warrant for such deeds. End quote. Are they not? Said she. Then neither are thick legs and wide shoulders. Or by what means did you gain these lands that ye boast of? Are there not, as I hear men say, wild folk in the caves of the mountains, who once roamed here free, ere ye swart folk came hither, and hunted them like wolves? I'll stop the quote there. But, there's your more layering. Wow. There's more of your sort of back and forth there.
Very everyone is problematic. I feel like
yes. That's what stood out to me when I gave it a reread the other night, because I was like, in the back of my brain, I'm like, doesn't this story have something to do with? And I'm reading that, and yeah, it's sort of like no one is innocent is the best way to put it. Everyone, history is a mess, and this one power claiming like, hey, we always been you were the invaders, you were not here first. It's sort of like it just sort of in its own way, it's a useful acknowledgement of history. Yeah. Again, do I think Tolkien's the best person writing on this? I wouldn't say that. Do I think it's at all? Do I think it's at least a recognition that history is a mess?
Right.
I'll take that.
Feels timely too in this age where I know so many immigrants who to America. Fairly recent immigrants who, oh my goodness, do they have thoughts about other immigrants? Oh my goodness. It feels very much of a piece of, well, I've been here for this long and they haven't. And that's kind of the big difference. And the newer immigrants are like, okay, but you also, and it's like, no, it's fine. We're fine. Everyone's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, Tolkien, he can be complicated. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
and it would have been so interesting if he had, and you were saying this, Jared, if this stuff was more well known, because it's so easy to reduce the work to a strict caricature when it's more like, nah, it's more like you gotta you gotta look through a lot. So we could, yeah, a sigh is about right.
Yeah.
But Ghân-buri-Ghân, just it's an interesting moment. It's a really fascinating episode. It's for what it doesn't say as much as what it does say.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately the fact that it has been left out of the major adaptations is a real shame, because I think the character really complicates narratives in a very interesting way, and I think should be much more well known. And I guess I'll end it there. Keeping an eye on the time, knowing that we need to wrap up here fairly soon, it's now time to talk about the topic for next time. It is Oriana's choice. Take it away, please.
This question of adaptation is actually perfect, because it segues right into mine. Because Ned, this is what I thought that you were going to choose as your topic when you were doing your little mystery building in tease before you revealed yours. So mine, I would like to read a passage for you guys to introduce mine. Hey doll, merry doll, ring a dong dillo, ring a dong, hop along, fa lol the willow, Tom Bomb, jolly Tom Bombadillo. It's time to talk about Tom Bombadil.
Yes.
My good benches. Because speaking of adaptation, he has, I feel like Tom Bombadil is, I don't know about divisive, but you either hate him or barely tolerate him, I feel like, in a lot of ways. But I think he's a really good way to talk about adaptation and what does and does not make the cut in various forms and influences on such a bizarre character. Like, why is this in here? Why is Tom Bombadil there? What possible use is Tom Bombadil? So all these and more, November. Get ready, everyone.
Here it comes with that. So, and yeah, boy, I mean, just the fact that the only work that Tolkien published in his lifetime that was anything close to not even a sequel, but a supplement to Lord of the Rings was the collection of poetry that features is all about him too. It's like, oh, there's a lot. Good choice. Good choice. And I can't wait to see what Jared draws that time.
Yes.
Dear God.
Yes.
We're putting you through your paces. So, a quick programming note, reference as much to ourselves as anything else. So, we will be doing our next episode a little more quickly than last time. This is just due to the holiday weekend that's coming up mid-November, and then after that, it's also just going to be packed even more. So, long and short of it, we'll be recording our next episode in first weekend of November, and we will hope to have it to you shortly after Veterans Day. And then we'll be doing similar in December, where we maybe you have to record like literally right after Thanksgiving, like the Sunday after or something like that, just to stay on schedule, just because of things I've got going. So we'll work this out, but basically expect a slightly accelerated schedule for these next couple of episodes, and we hope you enjoy that. And beyond that, well, good talk over a deep subject that, again, there's so much more we could say. There's so much more that has been said, but we hope it gave you something to think about. Any last thoughts from either of you two?
I hope I didn't say anything that reveals that, like, gets me canceled or something. I'm sorry in advance.
The whole time I was like, are there unconscious biases at work here? What am I saying?
I was like, oh, how many wrong things am I saying? So sorry in advance, and if there are any teachable moments, please reach out and let us know,
for sure.
because we all want to learn.
Yeah. And, like I said, we got a good response from the last episode of some further reading to do. We'll take more thoughts. We want them. So, and we appreciate them, but we appreciate you all listening in. So thank you all very much, and we will all talk to you next time. Until then. Thanks again for listening to this episode of By the Bywater. Please subscribe and rate us via your favorite podcast listening options.
Episodes and show notes are at megaphonic.fm/bythebywater, all one word. You can also message us through here. Email us at bythebywater@megaphonic.fm or follow us on Twitter at By-The-Bywater.
You can also follow us individually on Twitter and ask questions there. I'm at Vandroid Helsing.
I'm at Schwinter, SCHWINDTER.
And I'm Ned Raggett, 2 G's, 2 T's. By the Bywater is a proud member of Megaphonic Podcast Network. Find all our fancy little shows at megaphonic.fm. We hope you join us again next time. Until then, Namarie.